So Rachel is a close collaborator and a good friend of PRHE's on top of being just a stellar human being. She has a joint appointment at UC Berkeley, both in their School of Public Health and the Department of Environmental Health Sciences, which I am an alum of, and the Department of Environment, Science, Policy, and Management. Her research examines social determinants of environmental health among diverse communities with a specific focus on inequality, psychosocial stress, and how these factors interact with environmental chemical exposures to produce health inequalities. Rachel's also developed science policy tools for assessing the cumulative impacts of chemical and non-chemical stressors, which I know we're all very interested in cumulative impacts, and specifically to improve regulatory decision-making and advance environmental justice, which is a little bit about what she'll be talking about today. So without further ado, Rachel.
Great, thank you. So today I wanted to, we've been getting a lot of doom and gloom in the news lately. So I'm hoping that this conversation that we have today about integrating the science of cumulative impacts into climate change policy in California can give us pause and help us think a little bit about a better future in terms of that kind of mashup. So I want to start with the premise that, and not surprising for everyone in this group, that there's definitely an issue related to the climate gap. Back a long time ago, around 2008 and 9, it's hard to believe, the feds were actually thinking about passing a climate change bill. And at that time, there was a effort to get equity into the conversation in order to build more constituency support for climate change, in part because a lot of the mainstream environmental groups needed to do more to reach communities of color who were very strong constituencies for climate change legislation. Polling consistently shows that communities of color are much more concerned and actually willing to pay for the costs of climate change regulation than their white counterparts, in part because they're more likely to suffer disproportionately from the impacts of climate change, whether that's extreme weather events, rise in infectious diseases, worsening air pollution exposure and its health impacts, but also the economic costs of climate change in terms of the ways in which we're paying a greater cost for basic necessities, whether that's food, energy costs, and other things, and then also given their representation in very vulnerable economic sectors, service industry, tourist industry, other kinds of things where they're more likely to suffer from shifting job opportunities and significant job losses and or property loss due to disasters related to climate change and under or no insurance. So we tried to lift up this issue related in this report that we wrote called The Climate Gap for Decision Makers at this time. So unfortunately, that bill did not pass. And meanwhile, we've been really beginning a lot of scientific work, or a lot of scientific work has been going on for a while, documenting the effects of climate change among vulnerable groups, whether it's related to wildfire. This is a study that we did looking at a wildfire in Southern California, where we showed that on average, there was a 6-gram decrease among women who were pregnant during these wildfire events and living in that area. So this is related to kind of the generational equity issue. But there's other really good work showing, for example, the disproportionate effects of heat. In this case, looking at racial disparities in the effects of heat related to risk of preterm birth among residents in California, where you see the highest effects among Black mothers. Also, heat-related mortality. So folks at the University of Michigan have done some really powerful work looking, for example, at mortality risks in major cities in the United States related to heat. And this is showing us on the left panel are the mortality risks related to heat events in 4 major cities: Pittsburgh, Detroit, Minneapolis, and Chicago, among Black residents in those cities. And the lighter panel on the right is the mortality risk effects on white residents in those cities. And then what you see on the x-axis here is that this is also associated with the prevalence of air conditioning in homes. And so part of this racial disparity has to do with people's access to the technologies, things like air conditioning, to adapt to when these major heat events happen. So we've been doing some work looking, for example, at the disparities in heat islands. We've looked at this in relationship to racial residential segregation among major metropolitan areas of the United States. So the red areas are major cities in the US that are considered hyper-segregated, and the yellow areas are metropolitan areas that are considered moderately segregated. And we wanted to look at this in relationship to the risk of living in a high heat island prone neighborhood across the US. And so we can see both the segregation effects stepwise. So each one of these colors represents a racial or ethnic group as identified by the US Census. And we see both a racial disparity, but also an effect by segregation. So if you look at the white panel here on the left with the blue dots, white residents are much worse off, those who live in more segregated cities versus their white counterparts that live in less segregated cities. And this is true for all other racial ethnic groups, but you still see a racial disparity. In California specifically, this is looking at heat island risks in Los Angeles, Sacramento, San Diego, and San Francisco. This is looking at with the increasing proportion of residents of color in neighborhoods for each of the major metro areas. And the brown bars represent the proportion of land cover that's impervious surface, and the green bars represent green space. And you can see as the proportion of residents of color increases, you get less green space and more impervious surface, which is an indicator of heat island risk. So in a nutshell, this climate gap, you know, we've been doing a lot of catching up to community wisdom on this issue to basically document the problem. And regulatory science still has not done a great job about accounting for the cumulative impacts of these hazard exposures and the socioeconomic ways in which social inequality exacerbates this. And we need to think about this more in climate policy. And also, how do we sort of better merge sustainability goals, i.e. reducing greenhouse gases, with our goals to advance environmental justice and equity when we're forging climate change policy and regulation. So California passed the Global Warming Solutions Act in 2006. And essentially, in a nutshell, the law required us to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions to below 1990 levels. So that was roughly a 25% reduction under business as usual estimates. These rules went into effect in 2012, and in 2016, California basically hit its 2020 emissions reduction goals. So we hit it actually a little bit early. The Air Resources Board, which is the primary agency responsible for implementation of the law, announced in 2018 that we had hit our goal in 2016. Then in 2016, we passed SB32, which mandates now even more ambitious reductions, so about 40% below 1990 levels by 2030. So just to give you a sense of the trends in statewide greenhouse gas emissions goals and where the law is hoping to take us, this is AB32. This is the law that was passed in 2006. And we, as I said, we hit this goal early. The original goal was for us to hit this by 2020. And SB32 wants to get us down here to 40% below 1990 levels. Much more ambitious. So one of the things about climate change policy is that, and when the debates are starting to happen, and even when the laws haven't passed, but industry can often see the writing on the wall, they start to respond. And so one of the things that's happened in California over a period of 10 years was that several power plants in the state were retired. In part, 2 of them were coal plants, and a couple of them were old plants, one of which was in Bayview Hunters Point, which has been an epicenter of environmental justice organizing for a while. And so me and my collaborators thought, well, let's look at this. Can we sort of document some of the short-term health benefits of the ways in which industry reacts to climate change policy? Because oftentimes we're talking about greenhouse gas emissions that's very much in the future. But I think, we can do a lot more to document sort of the short-term health benefits of the ways in which we change and reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So in the case of power plants, we know that with every ton of greenhouse gas it emits, it's also emitting a lot of co-pollutants that we know are bad for health, whether that's particulate matter, sulfur dioxide, VOCs, and other kinds of things. And so with every reduction in greenhouse gas, we can get improvements, short-term improvements in air quality. And so we were able to show, for example, that with these power plant reductions, pollution levels based on air quality monitoring data near these plants. This is the blues are the pre-plant closure levels, and then the post-pre-plant plant retirement levels, both at 5 kilometers, 5 to 10 kilometers, and 10 to 20 kilometers. Air quality did improve during this period of time. And then even more importantly, we were able to document improvements in preterm birth rates among communities that were living close to these power plants in the wake of the closures. So preterm birth rates decreased by about 2% after adjusting for a lot of other factors. So you can see that overall, this 2% reduction at people who are folks that were living within 5 kilometers of these plants. And we could even see a reduction for folks that were living within 5 to 10 kilometers. And the other interesting thing is that we saw, even though this is not statistically significant, we did see slightly stronger benefits for Black and Asian mothers. So we basically saw a change in preterm birth rates from 7 to 5% in the post-retirement period, and these benefits were slightly stronger for women of color. And another study that we did also indicated improvements in fertility rates during this time. So environmental justice advocates point to these kinds of things to say one of the big tools in California's climate change policy is a cap and trade program, which has been somewhat controversial because EJ advocates want more targeted regulation of the facilities that they're regulated facilities that they host, because they want to ensure that climate change policy can benefit the communities that are most affected by them who are living nearby, and hopefully address the co-pollutant problem. And so there was a lot of struggle initially to try and not have a cap and trade program on the part of environmental justice advocates. They wanted something more direct regulation, like a fee or a tax, to incentivize regulated industries to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And their argument was basically this, that here's an example. So they felt that you could have a situation where you have 2 regulated facilities. In this case, you have a power plant here near Bakersfield, California, and an oil refinery in Torrance, California. They both emit about the same amount of greenhouse gases, okay? But one emits about 40 tons of PM10, and the refinery emits about 415 metric tons of PM10. The refinery has over 800,000 people living within a 6-mile radius, and the power plant has around 1,000. And yet a cap and trade program treats these both as equal in terms of greenhouse gas benefits. And EJ advocates point out that, like, you might want to incentivize the refinery to be reducing more deeply, given the number of people affected and the co-pollutant issue. And so there was a lot of effort to try and get ARB to assess the impact of its cap and trade program and the extent to which the cap and trade program might be incentivizing local greenhouse gas reductions, and how it was performing in terms of localized reductions, not reductions both within and outside the state, but really localized reductions. And so we did this analysis to show, we looked at all the regulated facilities within California, and you can see that overwhelmingly they're disproportionately located in communities of color and also disadvantaged communities based on CalEnviro screen. And what we found was that while overall greenhouse gas emissions in California have dropped, as I showed you before, that we reached our target goal of greenhouse gas emissions early, most of those reductions happen with low-hanging fruit from outside the state. For example, where we were sourcing our energy from outside the state, that counts as greenhouse gas reductions. But if we just looked at reductions in the extent to which they were being incentivized to happen within the state, that pattern varied a lot by sector. So during this first compliance period of the cap and trade program, this is looking at changes in annual average greenhouse gas emissions after the implementation of California's cap and trade program. This is looking at overall trends in emissions, and you can see that across all these regulated sectors, it didn't really improve that much overall, and that there was a lot of variability across sectors in terms of which sectors improved and which sectors actually got worse in terms of increasing greenhouse gases, which has implications for co-pollutants, because we know that there's a lot of correlation between the greenhouse gas emissions and localized co-pollutants. So this equity concern that EJ advocates have articulated about cap and trade ended up having some merit based on this analysis. There's an attempt now to kind of redo this analysis now that we're coming up on another compliance period. But meanwhile, industry is still paying for something that they used to do for free through the cap and trade program. They have to purchase allowances through the auction, and this is going to our general fund. And so even though they lost this larger battle to try and get our regulatory tools to move away from a cap and trade program, a lot of groups came together and thought, well, how do we sort of address the situation and integrate equity and sustainability goals in the climate change policy that we have now? We are stuck with a cap and trade program, but we are getting these revenues. And so legislation was passed to create what is now known as the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, SB 535. And this creates revenue from the regulation of all these industrial facilities that have to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And it seeks to both incentivize reductions of pollution and greenhouse gases through investments in disadvantaged communities. The goal is to enhance co-benefits and health benefits of greenhouse gas reductions. 35% of these funds must be spent on programs that benefit vulnerable groups, and 20% must be invested directly in those neighborhoods. So we had been working with the Air Resources Board before the passage of this legislation to develop a decision-making tool with them to help them pinpoint communities that should be targeted for more regulatory attention, and we called it the Environmental Justice Screening Tool. The goal was to develop a mapping tool that could identify places with cumulative impact problems related to social vulnerability factors and also the presence of multiple environmental hazards. The goal was to also make this a mapping tool that was transparent and relevant to a variety of communities and decision makers, and that could be used for everything from land use planning to investments and community outreach and engagement. And this was before the passage and the creation of the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. And we did a lot of ground truthing and community engagement to develop this tool. We got a lot of feedback on what kinds of indicators would be really important, because if decisions were going to be made based on this mapping tool, folks had to trust it and understand and be able to kick the tires and look under the hood to really understand its benefits and also potential pitfalls and shortcomings. So we spent a lot of time doing that. This is kind of a shot of what our map looked like in the east, in the Bay Area. And these are the different kind of buckets of indicators that you map. So everything from proximity to hazards, looking at air quality. This is very air focused because it was initially for the Air Resources Board. Social and health vulnerability indicators, mostly from data from the US Census. We had a climate change vulnerability bucket looking at heat islands, changes in mean apparent temperature, drinking water, and then we had sort of a cumulative impact score, which integrated all of these buckets together. So we kind of had a foundation, and when people were looking at this legislation and trying to figure out, well, how are we going to identify these neighborhoods where we want to invest these greenhouse gas reduction funds? Initially, people were like, well, we should just use the environmental justice screening method. And we were like, actually, no, actually the Cal EPA should create its own version of the environmental justice screening method and adopt it as its own. And so ultimately that is what happened. Many of you already know about this, but this morphed into Cal EPA's Cal Enviro Screen. We collaborated a lot with the Office of Environmental Health Hazard Assessment in the development of this screen, and they made some different choices, many of which were great, but this is now the tool that is used to identify where these investments should be happening to comply with that aspect of the rule that requires that 20% of the money be invested in these disadvantaged areas. And again, Cal EPA and OEHA did a really nice job in also trying to, again, do community engagement in the development of this tool and get feedback. And every time they update it, they go through a pretty extensive comment period to engage stakeholders in any changes that they make it when they're updating it. So, and these are the indicators, very similar to ones that we've used. Some of them are different, but they have these different buckets related to pollution burden and then population characteristics of vulnerability, health vulnerability, and socioeconomic factors. And so this is the tool that is used now to target the investments for greenhouse gas reduction funds. This is a very transparent process. People can go online and look where these investments happen. They have a great map. You can look at all the agencies and the programs that administer this money. These are the kinds of programs that are sort of funded to advance climate justice in communities, everything from urban forestry projects, affordable housing projects, transit projects, green energy projects, clean vehicle programs, other kinds of things. Over $11 billion have been appropriated by the legislature to fund these different programs. You can read about the project profiles online. I strongly encourage you to look at this. So I just want to end by saying that this is the ways in which I think cumulative impact science was leveraged in a way I think that is positive to really help the state of California merge its goals to advance sustainability efforts by reducing greenhouse gases and hitting climate change goals, but also knowing that equity has to be part of the equation, particularly if we're going to protect the most vulnerable communities in the state against the impacts of climate change and bring everybody along together. So I'm going to stop there and happy to take questions.
Yeah, thank you so much, Rachel. And I also wanted to encourage anybody who has a question to just unmute themselves. And I've got one question from Trish, at least, that I'll start everybody off with, which is, boundary conditions are an important decision for relative rankings. Could you please say a little bit more about how state versus regional rankings were decided upon? Thank you.
Yeah, so that's an interesting issue. So when we did our environmental justice screening method, we did the rankings by region. And I think that's one kind of major difference. And we felt like it was important to the different kind of pollution and population characteristics tend to be more regional, and we felt that that was a more fruitful strategy. I think for Cal Enviro Screen's purposes, they really felt it was important to do a statewide ranking. And to some extent, given that they're a statewide agency, that multiple agencies and programs are starting to use this tool. So now it's not just only for climate change policy, but it's for a lot of other things. And there was a feeling that that was probably the best path for agencies that are doing regulatory enforcement strategies statewide. That said, the data within Cal Enviro Screen is available, and so agencies, have the ability to sort of re-rank things regionally if they choose to do so. So regional agencies like the Bay Area Air Quality Management District, for example, could do a focused look at what's going on within the Bay Area.
Awesome, thank you. Any other questions?
Hi, I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about what the goals of monitoring specific regulatory and manufacturing sites are. We've seen a lot of that having happened historically here in the Northeast region. And so I'm curious if any potential collaborations or information sharing or partnership work might be able to find some solutions that would work for people in these communities at risk.
So are you talking about like air quality monitoring, or I just want to make sure I'm understanding your question?
Oh, thank you. I'm talking about not only air quality monitoring, but also the specific manufacturers, point source emitters, and also with regard to the location, as you mentioned before, in terms of like if there's a large population nearby and there's a certain amount of emissions, calculating potential specific impacts and using that as an opportunity to track not only the specific PM and breaking down, what's in PM10, but also understanding, I guess, the who, what, where, when, and why of these chemicals, and just trying to make sure that people aren't exposed to these cumulative exposures, I guess, from not only the beginning, but the end of the byproducts in the air and all of the great work that you're doing tracking this.
Yeah, so there's been some recent legislation that's being implemented known as the community, it's the CAPS program, Community Air Protection Program. And that legislation is referred to also as AB617. And the goal of that was, again, in response to environmental justice concerns that policy, particularly climate change policy, needs to better account for the localized effects of these regulated industries. And so that is providing resources and grants to communities that are affected by some of these emission sources or multiple emission sources. So it could be a community, for example, that's affected by a major industry, or that's near a port, so it's multiple emission sources due to a specific activity that's going on there. And that funds everything from better characterizing the air quality. This is very air focused because it's administered by the Air Resources Board, but the localized impacts, air quality impacts of these industries, and then providing them with the capacity to come up with localized clean air action plans to reduce the localized emissions of those sources that are disproportionately impacting the health of the communities nearby. So that's been in effect for about 2 years. It's still a work in progress. And I think there's been some really good successes in some communities. Other communities, I think, have industries that they're trying to affect that are a bit more harder to do. I think a lot of it also depends on the actual capacity of the community organizations that are doing this work in collaboration with the local air districts. So yeah, there has been some work around that, and there's legislation and financial support, although it's unclear what's going to happen now with the state budget, whether what's going to be available in this coming year in terms of resources to keep that going. I see another question. Is there any reason why Cal EnviroScreen couldn't be used in other states? So there are other states that are actually trying to develop their own versions of Cal EnviroScreen. And again, I think this is in part motivated by the fact that some of it's motivated by just trying to improve environmental regulation more generally. And some of it's also motivated by states that are trying to implement their own climate change legislation because, as we all know, the action around climate change is at the state level these days because things are so dismal at the federal level. So states like New Jersey, Connecticut, New York, Washington have been trying to develop their own kind of versions of Cal EnviroScreen. They've consulted a lot with folks in California like myself and folks at OEHA. And then US EPA actually did develop its own version of this. It's called EJ Screen. Not surprisingly, it's not being used very much right now, but there were a lot of folks that have sought to develop something similar that could be federal. And I think the other issue is that in California, we're very fortunate because we're a huge state and we're a very data-rich state. We have a lot of data on a lot of different things, and our agencies, Cal EPA, is actually really good at making that data publicly available for people to do innovative things with it, like create tools like this and do proof of concept that then agencies can in turn develop. So I think we're also very fortunate as a state to be very data rich and also be in a climate where that data is readily available, and other states are not quite so fortunate.
Awesome, thank you, Rachel. I also wanted to highlight a comment from Miriam Diamond, wanting to know, you spoke about disparate risk versus in terms of racialized groups. Could you comment on poverty as an indicator of high risk?
Yeah, so we definitely, in terms of studies that have been done to look at, for example, the extent to which low income and poor are potentially more vulnerable to the toxic effects of certain pollution exposures. That has definitely been shown. Also, if you look at just disparities in exposures, it is true that studies often show disproportionate effects on low-income communities. That said, a lot of studies show that even after taking into account things like income or proportion living in poverty or concentration of poverty in certain neighborhoods and other kinds of things, the racial disparity still persists. So I think it's important to just really make sure that we're kind of looking at both, and also be cognizant of the fact that even after you take into account the fact that folks of color tend to be disproportionately poor and of low income because of systemic racism and other kinds of things, that those racial disparities persist even after taking into account poverty and or income.
Excellent, thank you. We have time for one more question. If somebody has a very good question or a question that you're sitting on that's burning in your heart, but then otherwise we're gonna have to close the Q&A. So anybody?
This is Mary Gant with Green Science Policy Institute. I found your data on the reduction in short-term pregnancy and early birth very interesting. Do you have a comparable information on respiratory effects of reduction in air pollutants due to your cap and trade program?
No, I haven't. We have not done a study on the respiratory effects. And you know, just to clarify, those power plants shut down, many of them before the rules went into effect. Many of them shut down in anticipation of the passage of the law, and also because those plants were, you know, becoming dated and probably not cost effective. But again, it was an opportunity to demonstrate that, like, in response to policy change and when industry makes these shifts that could potentially be beneficial to health, we could document the short-term health benefits. We did it with birth outcomes, in part because we had really good data. We were able to be opportunistic about it, and documenting the exposure, you know, is a lot easier than looking at respiratory effects, and we didn't have that data handy.
I think it's really important when you talk about the advantages of doing something about greenhouse gases, that you also talk about the immediate health benefits to those reductions.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's a huge part of really the importance of lifting that up, because a lot of communities, this is what they really care about, is the short-term health benefits of climate change policies. They're going to make their lives better now. And while, you know, reducing the effects of climate change into the future is obviously very important, lifting up that you can actually get pretty significant benefits, and the economic benefits associated with improved health too is really important. I don't think we do a good enough job at documenting that.
Excellent. Thank you, everybody, for your really active questions. I love this. And thank you, Rachel, also for your presentation, which was incredible.
Thank you.
Everybody should follow Rachel on Twitter. Her Twitter handle is here. She posts really great and excellent content and is